to say a warm welcome to everyone. My name is Merve Isfahani. I'm the Academic Programs Coordinator at Columbia Global Centers Istanbul. Today, we're delighted to host our fifth workshop on unlikely dialogues in art as part of our program on voices of emerging scholars. We believe in the importance of creating ongoing scholarly conversations on global scale, and we cannot wait to hear more about the research of our guest speakers today. I would like to remind you that we will have a Q&A session after the presentations, so please feel free to post your questions online on the Q&A box. You can start posting your questions as soon as we start. Let me leave the word now to Professor Zeynep Çelik to introduce you to our panelists and speakers and today's program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Merve. Welcome to our fifth webinar, Unlikely Dialogues in Art. As always, my gratitude goes to İpek Cem Taha, the director of the Columbia Center in Istanbul, Merve Tezcanlı İsfahani, Academic Programs Coordinator, Cezanne Gürlek, the Program Officer, and James Leitner, whose generous sponsorship is much appreciated. I thank our participants, Alev Berberoğlu, Emilia Meyer, and Ursugue Carraghers for their innovative, engaging, and well-researched papers, and for adhering to our cumbersome preparation process. Finally, I would like to say a great thank you to Professor Peter Christoph, who graciously accepted to be our discussant. Today's papers are about art production, centering on artistic dialogues between a husband and a wife, an Italian couple living and working in Istanbul, and between European and Soviet artists and modernist Turkish painters. Through close readings of a few paintings, the papers open questions on identity, politics, uses of history, citation, cross-cultural currents, patronage, and beyond. They cover two slices of history, from the 1888 to World War I and the 1930s, thus moving from the late Ottoman decades to the young Turkish Republic and presenting two different worlds. Zannaro's productive career blossomed during the Hamidian era and continued under the second constitutional government. The period that framed Cemal Tolu and Nurullah Berk's works we will be discussing today corresponds to the ultimate status moment of the Republic. From the artistic perspective, if the earlier period is the high point of Orientalism, the second stands out in its formal modernism, a concept that we will be talking about. The papers on Tolu and Berk examine the interactions of Turkish artists with their colleagues abroad. It may be useful to situate them in reference to their own artistic heritage and to the art historical discourse in Turkey at the time. This discourse, valorizing Ottoman historic heritage and looking for ways to apply it to contemporary practice, arguably goes back to the 1870s to Usul-i Mimari-i Osmani. However, it took a major turn in the early years of the 20th century, as testified by the writings of Celal Esat, who focused on the identity of Ottoman art in counter-argument to flatten the European assumptions. 20 years later, in 1926, Ismail Hakkı expanded Celal Esat's vision by a long, powerful essay, Research on Turkish Arts. We published these texts in Europe Knows Nothing About the Orient, and I recommend that you consult them if you are interested in the topic. We must also pay homage to the tremendous contributions of Süheyl Ünver, who engaged in scholarly archival research to deconstruct Adolf Talasso's thesis that no Ottoman painting existed prior to 1874. We'll hear more on Talasso in Alev's paper. It is intriguing to think about Tolu, Berk, and Unver crossing paths in the 1930s in Paris, where the first two were following the contemporary trends, while Unver studied Ottoman miniatures at the Bibliothèque Nationale. What I'm trying to say is that the Turkish artists did not only respond to European movements, but were also coming to terms with their own complex history, as well as the local heady art historical debates. Even though we do not have the time to deal with these issues today, it would be unfair to ignore them as we explore the development of modern Turkish painting, hence my 2 pennies here. Following the template for all my webinar introductions, I will draw your attention to the wealth of sources our emerging scholars have been presenting, enriched today by the Turkish newspapers and periodicals, private archives, museum collections, and even personal interviews. Let me now introduce our speakers and our discussant. Alev Berberoğlu is a PhD candidate in the Department of Archaeology and History of Art at Koç University. Her dissertation, Unwritten Histories of Photography, Elisa Zonaro, an Italian photographer in Ottoman Istanbul, explores the work of a woman photographer active in the Ottoman capital at the end of the 19th century. In its broader parameters, Berberoğlu's research looks at the multicultural social life in 19th century Istanbul through women's experiences and through visual expressions. Emilia Meyer is Assistant Professor of Art History at Temple University. She holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research concerns the art and architecture of the Islamic world, particularly from the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. Before Temple, Meyer taught at Ohio State University and was a research collaborator in the Max Planck Research Group titled Objects in the Contact Zone, the Cross-Cultural Lives of Things at the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence. Ursugue Carraghers is a PhD candidate in art history at Northwestern University. Her research concentrates on transnational histories of modern art with an emphasis on the Turkish-French-Soviet axis in the first half of the 20th century. She was a fellow in her university's Paris program in critical theory in 2020-21. Her dissertation is tentatively titled Overcoming Haunted Futures, Art, Inheritance, and the Making of a New Turkey Between Capitalist and Socialist Worlds, 1922-1955. Peter Christoph, our discussant, is a visual artist working in painting, printmaking, drawing, and rug making. Recent exhibition venues have included the Museum of Modern Art in New York, CAM Gallery in Istanbul, Duke House in New York at NYU, and the Hammond Museum in North Salem, New York. In 2005, Peter had a solo exhibition of his rugs at the Museum of Hagia Sophia. He was selected as the first visual artist in residence at Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2015-16. Peter is part of the BFA faculty of his alma mater, the School of Visual Arts in New York. He teaches in the Fine Arts, Visual and Critical Studies, and Design and Art History departments. Peter's paintings and works on paper are in numerous public and private collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Moscow Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, American Express, and Yapı Kredi Bankası. He currently has a studio in Bethel, Connecticut, and in New York City. Peter has been exhibiting in Turkey since 1997, and he has a personal connection to the country. His family was engaged in the artistic and cultural life of Turkey for 3 generations. Like Peter, his father Demeter and his grandfather Peter Demeter were artists, while his mother Maria produced music programs for the state radio. In 2022, Peter will present an exhibition titled Legacy, the Christoph Family Archives at Yapı Kredi's Cultural Center. Let us now give the word to Alev.
Okay, I think it's visible, right? My presentation. Okay. The title of my presentation is Dynamics of an Artistic Duo, Reciprocal Influences between Elisa and Fausto Zonaro. And I'd like to begin my paper with a quotation from the arts writer and curator, Ellen Mara de Wachter. In her book, Co-Art, Artists on Creative Collaborations, she writes that, quote, "The history of art has generally overlooked collaboration as a key driver of artistic creation. Instead, it glorified the individual, usually male artist, as the ideal type." End of quote. Taking its cue from this critical perspective, the present study aims to investigate the creative dynamics of an Italian artist couple, Elisa and Fausto Zonaro, who lived and worked in the Ottoman capital from 1891 to 1910. It is an intentional shift from putting one artist in the limelight where, quote, "the creative individual is profoundly decontextualized," end of quote, in order to interpret the interactions between Elisa Zonaro's photography and Fausto Zonaro's painting. As I argue in my dissertation in progress, examining how Elisa and Fausto Zonaro enhanced each other's careers artistically and socially, will reveal the collaborative nature of their decision-making processes behind the scenes, and show how each of them utilized the other's forte so as to gain a sure footing in the late 19th and early 20th century Ottoman art environment. Having studied photography in Paris at the studio of the renowned portrait photographer Eugène Pirou from 1893 to 1894, Elisa Zonaro produced a variety of images in Istanbul that captured the vibrant social life in the urban environment, and took portrait photographs of distinguished people of the time at her home studio. Her husband Fausto Zonaro, a painter with a similar keen interest in depicting the daily lives of the Ottomans, made use of her photographs generously while creating his pictorial compositions. However, I argue that this creative process was not a one-sided appropriation of photographs by the painter Zonaro, but rather it was based on collaboration and exchange of ideas between the couple. The painting entitled The Ertuğrul Cavalry Regiment, dated 1895, which earned Fausto Zonaro the prestigious position as the court painter to Abdülhamit II, is a case in point. To create this painting that depicts the regiment passing across the Galata Bridge, Elisa and Fausto Zonaro worked together for several weeks. In an article published in the illustrated Ottoman journal Servet-i Fünun in 1898, Elisa Zonaro mentions how each time they went to the bridge, they had to wait for hours until the cavalryman appeared, and that Fausto Zonaro made sketches while they were passing. However, what she left unsaid, or perhaps the interviewer Mahmut Sadık omitted, was that while Fausto was sketching, Elisa was photographing the procession. In other words, it is highly probable that the two creative individuals whom I approach as an artistic duo could be working side by side on the same theme using different mediums they excelled in. Two photographs of the Ertuğrul Cavalry Regiment taken by Elisa Zonaro are still extant today in the Zonaro family archive in Florence, Italy. These photographs, which you can see on the left side of the slide, bear a striking resemblance to both the earlier version of the painting Fausto Zonaro made in 1895 and the later one he painted in 1901. They show how Elisa Zonaro's aesthetic and formal decisions regarding the composition of her photographs also laid the groundwork for Fausto Zonaro's painting. In the later version of this painting, currently exhibited in the National Palace's Painting Museum in Istanbul, Fausto Zonaro added a European couple who are identified as the Zonaro couple. I suggest that this addition to the original composition can be interpreted as a symbolic gesture of gratitude on the part of Fausto Zonaro to subtly acknowledge his ongoing creative collaboration with his wife Elisa Zonaro. A major work where we can trace their visual exchanges is Adolf Talasso's book Darshadet, Istanbul, Porte du Bonheur, published in 1908 as a limited art edition. As it is indicated on the title page, Darshadet was illustrated by Fausto Zonaro. However, although Elisa's role in the preparation of these illustrations has remained unacknowledged, a comparison between the photographs in the Zonaro family archive with these Darshadet illustrations reveal how effectively Elisa and Fausto Zonaro collaborated on this project as well. Analyzing the links between photographs and illustrations demonstrate that they employed different visual strategies throughout the book project. For example, in several illustrations, Fausto Zonaro made use of single photographs, whereas in others, he used a combination of several photographs taken by Elisa Zonaro. The chapters La Tour de Léandre and La Fête du Printemps are particularly worth mentioning since they include illustrations pertaining to the former category. Whereas the opening illustrations of the chapter Aisha or Ayşe is the result of a more elaborate creative engagement with Elisa Zonaro's photographs, owing to which Fausto Zonaro seamlessly brought together unrelated figural groups from different settings in a new composition, thus reinterpreting their original narratives to create another visual story. The chapter Bayram also begins with an illustration for which there are two corresponding photographs by Elisa Zonaro. Another instance is from the chapter La Prière du Matin, which was modeled on two stage photographs shot indoors. This illustration depicts a group of children that receive religious education, standing next to their instructors. It is significant to note that for one of the photographs, Fausto Zonaro was dressed like a dervish and posed for Elisa's camera, since this photograph demonstrates that the interaction between their artistic practices was quite layered, and just as Elisa posed for Fausto, he did the same for her. Therefore, positions of power between the photographer and the photographed, the painter and the painted, the gazer and the object of the gaze were constantly changing during their creative collaborations. The Zonaro couple also enhanced each other's careers socially, and the intersections in their social network facilitated new commissions. During the early years of their stay in Istanbul, Fausto Zonaro often frequented the foreign diplomatic circles who appreciated his art. These friendships paved the way for his appointment as a court painter in 1896. Once Fausto's ties with the Ottoman court were firmly established, Elisa Zonaro was noticed by Abdülhamit II. Known as an avid photography collector, the Sultan became interested in Elisa Zonaro's work and asked to see some of her photographs. As the subject, he specified flowers. In his autobiography, Fausto Zonaro writes that she took photographs of two groups of flowers, printed them onto silk, and made cushions for His Majesty's harem. Following this, she was awarded the second class of the Order of Charity in 1899. Pleased with Elisa's photography, Abdülhamit II also presented her the Fine Arts Medal in 1901. Furthermore, in her account book, Elisa Zonaro noted that in February 1905, she received 19 liras for photographic works she presented to the Sultan as gifts. Consequently, both her husband's esteemed position as the court painter and her photographic skills recognized by the Sultan must have facilitated her photographic activities in the city and ensured that she could take photographs without being hindered by the police. As Fausto Zonaro's fame grew, so did his social network in Istanbul, and Eliza Zonaro capitalized on these social connections efficiently. For example, Prince Abdülmecit was on friendly terms with Fausto. He admired his art and bought paintings from him. During his visit to the court painter's home in Akaretler, Abdülmecit Efendi signed the guest book of Galleria Zonaro in 1908, which you can see on the top left corner of the slide. It is likely that it was this occasion when Eliza Zonaro photographed him at their home studio. The photograph was printed in the article about Abdülmecit Efendi that Talasso wrote for L'Art et les Artistes in 1914. Both Eliza and Fausto Zonaro adopted an accommodating and humanistic approach in their social relations in the Ottoman Empire, which allowed them to remain neutral at times of conflict and maximize their earnings while befriending eminent people with opposite lifestyles or political views. For instance, they were maintaining their good relations with the Sultan, while at the same time, the prominent member of the Committee of Union and Progress, Enver Bey, who later became a pasha, were their trustworthy neighbor and acquaintance. It was during the chaos of the 31st March incident in 1909 when Enver Bey asked help from the Zonaro couple and entrusted his father to them until the danger passed. The following day, the order was restored and the two families celebrated the news with a party at the Zonaro's house in Akaretler. Eliza Zonaro took the occasion to photograph Enver Bey, his father Ahmet Bey, and his half-brother Nuri Bey. Moreover, she prepared two portraits of Enver Bey by cropping the group photograph, mounted them on decorative cardboard, and attached a red and white ribbon which symbolized freedom. Interestingly, Eliza Zonaro signed and dated these photographs and had Enver Bey sign them too. Observing the changing political climate, she might have considered these photographs as evidence that would prove they were on good terms with the rising powers. Thinking alike, Fausto painted a portrait of Enver Bey using 3 photographs taken by Eliza Zonaro. One was Enver Bey's portrait photograph, and the other 2 were photographs of soldiers. Another intersection in the Zonaro couple's social network was the painter Müfide Kadri. At a time when very few Ottoman women were professionally engaged in painting, she was taking painting lessons from Fausto Zonaro, Salvatore Valeri, and Osman Hamdi Bey. She was also on good terms with Eliza, which can be deduced from her handwritten note in 1907 in the guest book of Galleria Zonaro. Both this note and the formal elements in Müfide Kadri's only extant portrait photograph, such as the painted backdrop that appears only in Eliza's photographs, and the chair that is also present in other photographs from the house in Akaretler, led me to postulate that it was taken by Eliza Zonaro. In this paper, I have discussed how partnership and creative collaboration shaped and enriched the artistic duo Eliza and Fausto Zonaro's visual practices. I have argued that working together enhanced their careers not only artistically, but also socially, while expanding their range of commissions in the Ottoman capital. Furthermore, analysis of selected artworks have demonstrated several aspects of the interactions between Eliza Zonaro's photography and Fausto Zonaro's painting. Lastly, examining their social ties has shown how they benefited from the same network from different angles, and consequently, leaving their indelible mark on the late 19th and early 20th century Ottoman visual culture. All right, so now I'm handing it over to Emily.
You can see my screen okay?
Mm-hmm.
Good. So my talk today is citation as nation building in the paintings of Cemal Tolu. and this is dedicated to Yavuz Sezer and Michalis Theodorakis. In this presentation, we will take an in-depth look at the burning of Manisa during the War of Independence, İstiklal Savaşı'nda yakılan Manisa, a painting by the artist Cemal Tolu. This is a work that is incredibly rich and layered, and I propose that we use it as a case study to explore some wider themes and questions about the production of modern art and its surrounding critical discourse in the first decades of the Turkish Republic. Through an examination of this painting, accompanied by a close reading of the artist's own writings on art history and aesthetics, we will consider how Tolu tasked himself with generating a mode of expression that could capture the ethos of a new nation. Beginning in the 1930s, Tolu and other writers and artists in his milieu frequently deliberated in the press about the path that modernization should take in the arts of Turkey. Cemal Tolu endeavored to work through this question in his own paintings by adopting a visual vocabulary that triangulated a diverse range of aesthetic references, from French painting to Anatolian folklore and archaeology. Tolu's painting, The Burning of Manisa During the War of Independence, was most likely produced in the earlier part of Tolu's career in the late 1930s or early 1940s. It was during this period that the government of the new Turkish Republic encouraged and exhibited scenes from the War of Independence, as well as depictions of the Anatolian countryside. Tolu's painting features both. Manisa, a city in the southwest of Turkey, lies in a valley next to the foothills of Mount Sipilis, Spilda. As part of the Allied partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, the Greek army entered the town in 1919 and remained there for almost 2 years. The scene in Tolu's painting most likely refers to September 8, 1922, when the Turkish resistance forces recaptured Manisa, engulfed in a fire that would go on to wipe out most of the urban center. As Tolu served in the war as a cavalryman during along the Western Front, it is probable that he witnessed this event himself. While Tolu's composition that divides the painting into 3 horizontal sections and use of large blocks of color effectively flattened the picture plane, the subject matter is highly charged and evokes a visceral emotional response. The Turkish cavalry appear in the foreground of the painting, arriving to bring relief to the devastated inhabitants, with the smoking remains of the city and Mount Sipilis towering in the distance. Tolu's painting depicts a very specific moment in Turkey's history, yet it also incorporates citations to an astoundingly wide range of sources. First, the arrangement of the figures in the foreground recall Eugène Delacroix's massacre at Chios. The most evident connection in Tolu's painting is the nude woman cowering on the ground, accompanied by a swaddled infant and older women in red, which quotes Delacroix's indelible image of the bare-breasted cadaver. Another clear point of reference for Tolu's painting is the work of Paul Cezanne. The silhouette of Mount Sipilis' ridge in the burning of Manisa mirrors Cezanne's numerous views of Mont Sainte-Victoire. And Tolu's stratigraphic composition, which reduces spatial depth, is also an organizing structure characteristic of Cezanne's landscapes. In short, the burning of Manisa is a Cezannian landscape and Delacroix-esque themes reinscribed as markers of a distinctively Turkish past. Now let's take a moment to rewind about a decade earlier, when a delegation of students from the Fine Arts Academy in Istanbul, including Cemal Tolu, were sent to Paris for further instruction in painting, sculpture, and design. Tolu primarily studied in the atelier of Montparnasse with the painter André Lot, among others. Lot championed the post-World War I phase of Cubism that moved back from extreme fragmentation and sought a quote-unquote return to order. Similar to Braque and Picasso, Lot emulated the landscapes of Cezanne while elaborating on the artist's ideas about the solidity of geometric forms. Coming from this context, Tolu and his colleagues returned to Istanbul and set to work creating a new language for Turkish painting through the theories and modalities of Cubism. These painters showed their work in state-sponsored exhibitions and also formed independent artist groups, the most influential from the period being the D Group, D Grubu, of which Tolu was a founding member. Tolu categorically rejected the assertion that to embrace modernism was to leave behind earlier movements. Rather, Cubism was presented as a tool or lens through which any visual culture could be examined and even improved upon. In response to a journalist's question about his vocation in painting, Tolu wrote, "I want to create an art that moves forward the vitality of our era while upholding tradition." By the late 1930s, Turkish artists began to concentrate on more nationalist and social realist themes, particularly provincial Anatolian life. The current art historical narrative tends to characterize this period in Turkish art as one in which painters moved away from their European training and immersed themselves within a local context. But paintings such as The Burning of Manisa demonstrates that the reception of artists like Cezanne and Delacroix and the depiction of autochthonous themes are by no means mutually exclusive. In his own writings, Tolu positions himself as the rightful inheritor of Cezanne's teachings. In the article 50 years after Cezanne's death, the artist begins with a vignette of the old master painter as a spurned patriot who, in the streets of his hometown, faced the various insults of children while leaving to paint or returning home exhausted, and after all of this, still wanted to gift his works to the provincial museum. Tolu goes on to criticize the people of Aix, who organized various memorials in Cezanne's honor on the 50th anniversary of his death, sparing nothing in this aim to pay penance for sins formerly committed. And we can speculate why Tolu goes on to such great lengths here to deny the citizens of Provence of the right to declare Cezanne as one of their own. Perhaps by implication, this action relocates the true Cezanne reception in Turkey with Tolu. The role of Cezanne within Tolu's project of defining a Turkish artistic identity can be situated within the wider nationalist rhetoric that rooted modernity in rural values, traditions, and geography. After the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the new Republican government moved to Ankara, administrators were seeking to imagine Anatolia as the core of their homeland. This transition can be observed in Tolu's 1940 work From Istanbul to Ankara, in which the ancient citadel of Ankara, bathed in a golden halo of light and capped with the Turkish flag, rises above the gloomy Bosphorus landscape in Istanbul. In the art of this period, the citadel in Ankara becomes a trope for the Turkish Republic. In the majority of Tolu's provincial landscapes, the ubiquitous mountain looks not only to Mont Saint-Victoire, but also to Ankara, with the references working like geological layers collapsing into one another. In The Burning of Manisa, Tolu also looks to the art of ancient civilizations. In this same period, there were attempts in the national discourse to link the people of Turkey to Anatolia's pre-Islamic civilizations. One of the direct consequences of this project was the launch of several excavations of Hittite sites throughout central Anatolia and the establishment in 1921 of the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, where Tolu worked as the director beginning in 1935. His contact with the archaeological material made a deep impression. Tolu wrote that the, quote, plastic quality of ancient Anatolia, end quote, could be observed from the most ordinary pot or the grandest frieze. The artist's interest in the Hittites is abundantly evident in other canvases, such as the Hittite storm god, and the way many of the figures in Manisa burning stand in profile and are arranged in a frieze-like row, across the bottom of the canvas, also point to his intimate knowledge of Hittite relief sculpture. Here, Tolu unites a local prehistoric visual culture with the latest advances in modern painting, i.e. cubism, in a dynamic synergy. In his writings, the artist points out that Turkish painters could benefit just as much from visiting the archaeology and the ethnography museum as they could in the galleries of Paris. Tolu was thus able to relocate the features of modern art that he admired most, strict formalism and sculptural solidity, into the visual culture of the Hittites. By situating these formal values in a local context, Tolu argued for a modern aesthetic that was latent within his own geography. The painter Hamit Gürele wrote in an exhibition review that Tolu is a soulful scion of Anatolia. In his paintings, he always describes to us our own selves. How best then to understand the rich interplay of sources consolidated into this one canvas? In his writings, Tolu maintained that the act of citation or pastiche, rather than diminishing the individuality of an artist, in fact serves as an indicator of their creative agency. In a newspaper titled "The Influence in Artworks," Tolu directly responds to critics who accuse the artists of the Turkish avant-garde of plagiarizing painting. As for the works under question resembling the works of Delacroix or Moreau, this cannot be considered copying, because in both works there is a separate value in terms of showing the artist's interpretation of color and design, the possibilities of realization, and the personalities of our friends signing their works, along with benefiting from the aforementioned French masters in terms of composition. Many examples from art history are shown to us in this vein. In this passage, Tolu posits that every work of art is inherently imbued with an authorial presence, even if there is abundant citation of external models, and perhaps because there is an abundant citation of external models. In the burning of Manisa, Tolu was not just representing a specific historical event. He was engaged in the act of history making itself. When the artist painted the canvas in the late 1930s, 1940s, he was drawing upon his memory of an event already some 20 years past. Tolu also manipulates the composition, facture, and references, for in this canvas, Mount Sipylus becomes Mont Sainte-Victoire, and the people of Manisa share the same hardships as the Greeks on Chios. These additional layers of meaning do little to further our understanding of what took place on September 1922. These accretions do, however, provide insight into the project of forming a national identity through art. The painter and art historian Nurullah Burke reflected that it was with Lot, Leger, and Gromer that Jamal Tolu attained a true sense of artistic nationality. The claim that an artist can discover his national and individual personality, not in his home country but abroad, is a confounding proposition. Yet it is precisely by locating and putting pressure on these unstable fissures, where Turkish painters learn how to be Turkish in Paris, and the mountains of Aix stand witness to the destruction and deliverance of an Anatolian town, that we can appreciate the fundamentally ambiguous nature of nation building itself. By navigating this ambivalence, whereby identity is curated from disparate elements and under constant refinement and revision, Jamal Tolu knew well the power of citation in art, a concept that postmodernists would be credited with discovering decades later. that innovation and citation are not opposite, but rather complementary processes. Thank you. Okay, I will now pass on the baton to my colleague, Ursugue Carraghers.
Thank you, Emily. My presentation is titled Modernism, Statism, and the Public to Come. Nurullah Berk on the 1934-35 Soviet exhibition in Turkey. In a 1935 magazine article, the Turkish modernist painter and critic Nurullah Berk mobilized the work of his Soviet colleagues, Alexander Deyneka, Sergei Gerasimov, and Alexander Samokvalov to argue for state support of art, sanatın devletleştirilmesi. In so doing, Berk advocated for extending the Turkish Republic statist economic program into the visual arts. Recently implemented, statism sought to accelerate the nation's fledgling industrial production and infrastructural development. As a vocal member of the recently funded D Group, an artist group that positioned itself as, quote, non-official and independent, end quote, why would Berk call for the state's greater involvement in visual arts? Berk's article responded to a Soviet exhibition in Ankara, which opened on December 19, 1934, and later traveled to Istanbul. As stated in the article, he based his observations on the photographs from its Ankara iteration, some of which were reproduced in print media. Organized by the All-Union Society for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries, a Soviet state organization, the exhibition was unsurprisingly framed with socialist realism, the state-sanctioned Soviet art that was still being aesthetically formulated. The exhibition garnered much critical attention. My presentation will focus on Berk's response because he was the only modernist artist who publicly reacted to it. His text sheds light on the kinds of aesthetic and structural reflections that this exhibition might have generated among Turkey's modernist artists. Berk's appeal for statism in visual arts referred to a state-supported art system, which he saw as, quote, a necessity for painting and sculpture to take root, end quote. This framing implies that he perceived these art forms as rootless in Turkish society, a problem that state support could remedy. Although he did not describe what this art system would look like in practice, his examples suggested state financial and institutional support for arts production and dissemination in exchange for artists, quote, service to the authority, end quote. In advocating for a state-supported art system, Berk drew on the one hand from canonical Western European precedents of artistic patronage, including the support offered by the Borgias to Punturicchio, the Medicis to Michelangelo, and the Louis XIV to Rubens. Berk thus looked at Western Europe before a private art market proliferated in the 19th century. On the other hand, Berk was inspired by contemporaneous Soviet art policies, which he described as, quote, elevating, propagating, and making art loud, end quote. What he had heard about artistic reception in Soviet Russia especially animated him. Quote, they say that in today's Russia, the man on the street stops in front of a painting, looks at it, and loves it, end quote. Berk likely learned about the Soviet art system from recent events, such as prominent Russian painter Alexander Gerasimov's press conference in Istanbul a few months before the exhibition. This Gerasimov is not to be confused with Sergei Gerasimov, to whom Berk referred in his article. As several Turkish newspapers reported, Alexander Gerasimov emphasized the large number of artworks that various state bodies commissioned for the exhibitions that they organized. He underlined the great numbers of visitors flocking to see these exhibitions, a number that sometimes reached 1 million. Lastly, he recounted that the painters associated with the All-Russian Artists Cooperative received monthly salaries in return for a painting per year, for a few paintings per year, and that their pictures were shown throughout the country. In contrast to Gerasimov's focus on quantities, Berg's emphasis on the nature of the interaction between art and its audience in Soviet Russia reveals his yearning for such a reception in Turkey, where he felt that painting occupied a marginal social position. For instance, Berg complained in the same article about the public's lack of interest in art, both on the part of, quote, the man on the street and the man who lives in a grand house, end quote. Under these circumstances, the Soviet model offered the possibility that art could reach broader audiences and even creates its own public with state support. In the virtual absence of a private art market in Turkey, moreover, state support must have appeared as effective compensation for the dearth of economic infrastructure for modernism. Berg remained vague about how artists were to serve the state, implying that it would entail, quote, moving and enlightening the masses, end quote. Kütleyi kımıldatmak, aydınlatmak. Yet he was clear that artists should not become political propagandists. In a key passage, he wrote, bending art to the regime, one might think, amounts to restraints causing art to lose its gratuité, that is, its fundamental feature. Yet, what renders a work of art speculative is neither its subject matter nor its literary and social intention. It results from its lines, colors, composition, and dynamism. To think that limiting subject matter would hinder art is to divest oneself from the most primary artistic lesson. Here, Berg breaks down the counter-argument to statism in art in order to tackle it head-on, that if art tasks itself with serving the regime, it risks that which makes it art, gratuité. In this context, this French term suggests art's freedom from ideological interference. Although the conjunction yet signals that an elaboration of this term is forthcoming, he instead shifts to another French word, speculative, explaining it instead. Speculative implies here indeterminacy meaning. By so linking gratuité to speculation, Berg suggested indeterminacy as art's primary feature. He located indeterminacy not in what art depicts, but how. He finally returned to the hindering of art, framing it as a consequence of subject matter limitations. By compensating for subject matter limitations with open-ended meaning, he thus sought to reconcile art's freedom with its service to the regime. Berg's article exemplifies the ways in which Turkey's modernist painters juggled divergent priorities in the mid-1930s, including finding material support for their work, creating a public, developing their own painterly languages, and contributing to the making of a new Turkey. Certainly, this challenge of merging social and aesthetic pursuits predated the Soviet exhibition. Yet, I suggest that seeing the work of his Soviet contemporaries opened a window into an entirely new model of modernism that reworked modernist techniques to communicate shared revolutionary ideals and feelings to a broad public. Until this moment, Turkish artists' modernist references were limited to Europe, where modernism had been advanced mostly through dialogues between fellow artists and critics, and where artworks were increasingly shown and transacted under a dealer-gallery system. Like many of his Turkish colleagues, Berg was familiar with the European model from his educational stint in Paris. Berg framed paintings by Deyneka, Gerasimov, and Samokwalo as exemplary products of the Soviet art system, as proof that, quote, with state support, art does not have to lose its gratuité, end quote. Berg's own pictures offer some insights into what he saw as constitutive of gratuité or open-endedness in the works of his Soviet colleagues. When Berg penned his essay, he was primarily occupied with Cubist investigations. Two major paintings from around 1933, Still Life with Playing Cards and Aviators, demonstrate major Cubist devices that Berg explored across genres. A loss of spatial coordinates and depth through the dismantling of the linear perspective, a lack of three-dimensionality in the rendering of figures, and a reliance on the legibility of visual signs rather than their likeness. Deploying a popular symbol of Turkey's technological modernity, Aviators demonstrates Berg's attempts to harness modernist idioms in a painting with recognizable subject matter and broad public address. But he sought to do so without restricting the work's meaning through an ideologically motivated moral. To that end, the painting provides an instant look at the aviators rather than elaborating on their mission and judging its outcomes over a longer duration. At this moment in Berg's work, I propose works by Deineka, Samokvalov, and Gerasimov taught him that pictorial experimentation could be channeled towards new modes of depicting ordinary people, be they factory or collective farm workers, Red Army soldiers, or aviators. Berg's pictures from 1936 onwards illustrate the ways in which he made use of this lesson as he worked toward his self-described goal of, quote, making the artwork relatable to its local audiences, end quote. Sanat eserini beşerileştirmek. Deineka's Civil Aviation of 1932 in particular offered a painting of revolutionary feelings. Designed for the kitchen of an airplane factory, this large-scale mural elaborates on the aviation theme, which was prominent also in socialist modernity. The picture stages an interplay of transitive movements between people and the airplanes. The group of workers in the foreground, presumably aviation enthusiasts, are headed towards the airplanes, the aviator in the middle ground towards the workers, and finally, the two figures in the background towards either the terminal or the workers. The distribution of figures in space directs our eyes back and forth between them, translating the buzz of an active runway animated by the airplane's loud drone. The raised hands of various figures further imbue the picture with a sense of excitement. Deineka's individualized graphic style, evident in the flat depiction of the airplanes, the terminal, and the colossal mountain behind it, dramatizes this feeling. So does the exaggerated difference in the scale of the various figures and objects. The picture must have communicated this feeling to its Turkish viewers, as the populist educator Ismail Hakkı Tonguç described it as portraying, quote, the excitement of new ideals. Art historian Christina Kier has argued that Deineka's paintings reworked earlier modernist strategies of the Soviet avant-garde in his distinctive graphic style so that the audiences could, quote, feel socialism, end quote, while also comprehending it analytically. The mobilization of feelings in civil aviation was likely meant to animate the factory workers and evoke pride for their contributions to the socialist construction. Yet, following Kier's analysis, I suggest that the picture's power to move its viewers operated on a more general level rather than being harnessed towards predetermined outcomes. Berg must have been receptive to this aspect of Deineka's mural, given that his aviator similarly depicts a legible subject matter without restricting it with a straightforward ideological message. Like his fellow critics, Berg seems to have responded to Deineka's interest in communicating collective feelings, intuiting that the feelings conveyed through colors and composition cannot be ideologically contained. Deineka's painting might thus have inspired Berg in his search for an art that moves and enlightens people, while also serving the regime. This art exhibition constitutes one episode of understudied artistic exchanges between Soviet Russia and early Republican Turkey in the 1930s, facilitated by the travels of artists and exhibitions between the two countries. As I have shown, Berg's encounter with Soviet art reinforced his call to strategically tailor Turkey's status programs to meet artists' material and social needs so that they could develop a communitarian modernism for broad audiences. At the same time, this encounter encouraged him to move beyond the limits of Europe's modernist paradigms. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's my turn to present some of my questions to our speakers today. And I want to focus on something that Özge just said, which is about the excitement of new ideas, because I think that obviously what develops as modern is very much about new ideas, about innovation, and how artists strategize all of these things together to move forward. My first question is going to be to Alev. I'm particularly fascinated with the history of Elisa Zonaro. This was obviously an exceptional person, incredibly liberated, dare I say, modern for her time. This is someone who actually went to Istanbul prior to Zonaro joining her there. They were not married. I think this was probably something quite unusual for someone coming from sort of an upper middle class Italian family to do. And when they did get married, and he decided to go visit his mother, she went to Paris to study photography with her young son, in tow. So I wanted to know just a little bit more, because I feel that it's not really the Zonaro's work that we would consider modern. I think it's very, very much, as has been mentioned, sort of classic Orientalism, but their attitude and their approach to the market, to promoting themselves and to their work is what is truly exceptional and would be completely sort of relevant today, sort of like masters of social media. With all of this in mind and the history that you described, can you please kind of enlighten us about exactly what happened in terms of this partnership dissolving? And I don't necessarily mean in just kind of like a gossipy way, but it seems that once the Zonaros went to back to Italy, to Sanremo, and they shortly afterwards separated, it was still Elisa who maintained the kind of flame of Zonaro's reputation. And she is in fact responsible for the archives that we have of the work being produced, how it was produced, the documentation you spoke about. Please talk to us about this.
All right. So maybe we can talk about more on their activities when they returned to Sanremo. Mm-hmm. Actually, this part of their career is not well explored. And recently I saw a brochure that they prepared during their time in Sanremo. They had a similar kind of studio / home environment there, also a gallery, as they had in Akaretler in Istanbul. And there, to promote that gallery, they published a brochure, and on that brochure, there's this announcement that also photography lessons were given in that space, and there was a photographic studio also in that place. So probably Elisa Zonaro was continuing her photographic works there, but more research has to be done And due to the pandemic, it's really difficult to travel there. Hopefully in the near future, I'll be able to do this. Afterwards, around at the time of the First World War, their son died in the war. And following this, two of their daughters got tuberculosis. And all these health situations, health problems affected their work, their ongoing work. Yeah, that's why I think it was interrupted. This artistic collaboration was sort of interrupted.
Thank you. Aleph, one more question to you. In terms of the destruction of a lot of Elissa's negatives and photographs, was that a result of the First World War? How did that happen?
From the autobiography of Fausto Zonaro, we know that during their travel from Istanbul to, while they were leaving Istanbul after the reign of Abdülhamit II in 1910, during their travel, their cargo, their luggages are like in the open, and they got ruined due to the rain and other situations. So, but although we don't have many of those negatives, we only have one remaining negative that's kept in the family archive in Florence. It is possible to reach or to uncover more photographs of Elisa Zonaro by following their social network. And it's possible to find photographs, as I found one in this newspaper written by Talasso. It was like forgotten in those archives. Looking at those periodicals and also the local archives in Sanremo and Florence would be giving us more sources actually. Because she not only took photographs of the Istanbul, the environment, the street sellers, the daily life of the people, but also she took portrait photographs of many people, the Italians or the local, the bureaucrats, etc., who came to their studio, their home studio, and it's possible to find more of those photographs. And it's a discovery, surprising and happy discovery to find them.
That's a good adventure. Aleph, thanks so much.
Okay.
My second question is to Emily about Cemal Tolu. Formally, as you pointed out, he's using many of the compositional devices of Cezanne, of the teachings of André Lott, and as we had spoken about in the past, I had the good fortune of working with an artist here in New York who actually studied with André Lott. Her name is Henrietta Mantus, and Henrietta studied with him in Paris in the 1950s, so a while after Tolu did. But what she said was his insistence on understanding the passage, the transition in paintings, and not only formally, but also in terms of the content that is presented in the work. And what I'm particularly curious about in this painting is how we read the symbolism in the burning of Manisa, which of course references much more the attitude of Delacroix and much less what Cezanne was interested in, which was much more spatial. In looking at the painting, I felt like the use of the pink that is in the sky, and of course the same color pink coral that is in the reclining figure connects the idea of the burning village with the female figure with what transpired that we know of historically in terms of the female population of Manisa, which probably would not have necessarily been talked about, but implied. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about that symbolism, and also how the Delacroix, the massacre at Chios, and the burning of Manisa are like bookend paintings. Just a little bit more for those of us in the audience who may not really know that much about the historic events.
Sure, thank you so much for this question. Yeah, of course I could only cover so much in my time, but you know, it's not just what you're getting at, and what I think is a really important point here is that these are not just formal citations, and that, you know, sort of lifting figures from various paintings and dropping them in. It's also thinking deeply about the context of the subject matter and the content of these paintings. So with Delacroix, with this quotation from the massacre at Chios here, it's really a fascinating inversion of the situation. So in the massacre at Chios, we have the kind of sort of oppressive Turk figure, you know, sort of bearing down in a very forceful way on the Greek-speaking Christians of Chios, in the context of the, you know, sort of the lead up to the Greek War of Independence. That's what's going on in that painting. And here, this is like a fascinating, and I'm sure quite intentional, sort of inversion of the situation, right? Where it's the Turkish cavalry members who, you know, this sort of figure on a horse is now sort of the figure of deliverance, and is rendering aid to, reaching down, rendering aid to the people of Manisa, who are, you know, sort of marked here as Muslim, so as inhabitants of the town. So there's this interesting kind of inversion of the kind of scenario here. And also what's interesting is that the Delacroix, I mean, you know, we think of Delacroix as this sort of like history painting, right? But I mean, it's really reportage. I mean, you know, like Delacroix didn't go to Chios, but he was reading about it in the newspaper. And the massacre at Chios was more like the reporting of a contemporary news event, more or less. So it's interesting that in that way also, I think that Tolu is kind of engaging with Delacroix's artistic practice of really representing key events of the day. In this case, this is a manner of reportage on behalf of Tolu. And what's really interesting is, as you mentioned, that the connection between the figure here, the sort of Delacroix-esque figure of, especially of the nude figure. I think it's implied. It's not clear that she was raped. She may be dead. It's sort of, you know, left up to speculation. But there is a profound connection in this painting formally between this nude figure here and the mountain and the city burning. In fact, I think it's really fascinating that this kind of pile of clothes next to her, the way it's kind of here off to the side, really echoes the sort of plume of the smoke rising up from the town, and the way that the actual sort of ridges of her body emulates the ridges of the mountain. So really, in a very profound way, formally, the nude figure is connected to the landscape, to the destroyed, the city itself that is in a landscape, the geography that is in distress. So in a way, Tolu is sort of taking all of these references. This is what I'm kind of getting at, where takes the Delacroix and the Cezanne and formally echoes them in the painting in a formal manner. So kind of, as you just said, I think describing this as bookends is a very good way to put it, kind of bringing it all together in this single painting. So yeah.
You know, I also think it's interesting in terms of this bookend relationship, how both Delacroix and Tolu are also touching on ideas of nationalism, because certainly in France, with all of the upheaval that had happened, the reestablishment of the monarchy, things like that, ideas of nationalism were very much in the conscience of the public and of the artists, and as we've seen today, was something that was also a very big part of the inspiration of a lot of work in the early part of the Republic. Thank you.
I think, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And also in Cezanne as well, right? That he sort of, there's this whole narrative that's cultivated, that Tolu is part of cultivating this narrative of Cezanne as sort of like leaving Paris, the decadence of urban Paris, and going back to Provence, to the countryside, to paint the folk, you know, people, the geography of sort of rural France, like that's, and as a sort of a nationalist type of gesture, like Tolu is very much in tune with that. And I think that's what he's getting at when he talks in his article about the memorial of Cezanne in Aix, and how it's sort of insufficient, this sort of, because he's the sort of great patriot of the nation. So absolutely, I think that's just right.
What I do find so interesting about that is, as someone who has visited Cezanne's studio in Aix and has spent time in Aix, even at that time, Aix was hardly a small provincial village. and his father was, you know, a businessman and probably the major banker of Aix-en-Provence. And I think a lot of the kind of ridicule that Cezanne inspired was because he was eccentric, not because he was an artist necessarily. So there's a lot going on there. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'd like to speak to Özge about my third question about Berk, and about the notions of accessibility and greater reception to contemporary art in Turkey at that time. And of course, ideas of accessibility and reception, that's something that continues to plague artists. You know, we never get enough attention, we never get enough love, we never get seen enough. And there was a funny kind of coincidence. When we first met, I had come across a quote by the art collector and gallerist Yashi Baraz, which was from an interview that he gave in 2008 for a magazine called Artiz. And Yashi Bey says, "Tüm galeriler kapatsak kimsenin ruhu duymaz," which roughly translates to, if we closed all of the galleries, no one would care. So that being said, that, you know, there's a problem with the amount of love, attention, and money that was made available to the arts. I was completely fascinated by Burke's sort of comment and criticism of the difference between the reception for art in the Soviet Union, that millions could possibly line up to see an exhibition, and how foreign that was to our sensibility, to our culture. And I'm curious if anything came up in your research where Burke also talks about the tradition of the veneration of the icon. And so, for example, of course, you know, in Russia, certainly prior to the revolution, you know, the Bolsheviks made a good point of suppressing religion, religious belief and activity. But, you know, when you entered a church, the first thing you did was kiss a painting. And so to transfer that kind of relationship to the visual object, to the painting, to the icon, to then images that are made public, paintings made public, I think is an incredible parallel. And did any of that come across in your research when investigating Burke and his writings?
Thank you, Peter. That's a great question. And well, what Burke knew about the Soviets and their conditions of reception and artistic production there was certainly transmitted, communicated through their Soviet colleagues. And so we can say that Soviets are perhaps underlying certain information while omitting others. Mm-hmm. So I haven't come across in his writing where to his mention of that, to the reception of Russian icons. And that's a fascinating question, though. I think some Slavicists maybe can examine it in greater detail. But what I can say is that icons were important for some Russian modernist artists, avant-garde artists such as Tatlin. The element of materials potency in icons and the flatness of colors, it was really influential in Tatlin's work with collage, material collages, and then later corner reliefs, that material aspect. But certainly in Soviet Russia, they, in terms of the reception of icons after the revolution, certainly there were fewer opportunities to see them publicly, perhaps because there were much fewer churches left after the revolution. I mean, there were still churches where one could go and pray and even kiss them, but in Russia there was also this anti-religious propaganda. So sometimes they presented churches or religious icons with anti-Soviet propaganda text captions attached next to it. So but I think what Burke is talking about in terms of the love that a viewer might have for the audience, I'm suspecting that there might be something about the icon's reception there, because it's also a kind of love and veneration, though I haven't come across something in his writings.
Excuse me, were there other exhibitions of contemporary Russian work between the one that you spoke of in Turkey and subsequently the kind of freeze of the Cold War? Or was that the only one that we know of that that happened in Turkey of contemporary Russian art?
Yeah, this was the major exhibition that went to Ankara and Istanbul. And after that, I don't know of such major exhibition. Maybe if there are works coming, they would come through individual means, not through state-supported exhibitions. And also the mid-1930s and maybe towards the 37, it's the height of the Turkish-Soviet rapprochement between the two states. After that, with the Second World War, the relationship gets deteriorate over the question of straits, notably. And so I feel like it's the states' friendship, self-professed friendship in this period was really, it really facilitated. So after the 30s, there aren't many. I mean, there are Turkish painters exhibiting in Soviet Russia, a few exhibitions we know of, and I work on them in the rest of my dissertation.
I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we open up the conversation to our guests today.
Thank you very much. Now we will start the Q&A session. So we would like to remind our viewers to post their questions on the Q&A function. So we can start with two questions maybe. Two of the questions that we receive, actually, they deal with this transition from the Ottoman Empire to Republican Turkey. So all three figures, or to some extent, but more evidently Tolu and Berk. So they witnessed this transition. So one question is about that, it says in all the presentation, a narration was made through the actor. So how did the transformation and class differentiation of the state in this sharp transition period affect it? And then there's this other question, which is asking about, was there also a similar urban-rural divide in Ottoman, but also in the Republican Turkey, So this is a question to all of our speakers.
If I may perhaps start. So it was a conscious choice to study this period through the actors, because I believe that in a period where there is some scholarship, there's not very in-depth scholarship on this period, but in the extant scholarship, sometimes we hear that artists were coerced to produce certain kind of work, and how that extant scholarship doesn't really give much agency to artists. So that was a conscious choice on my part to present through the actors. But certainly for the second part of the question, it's truly a sharp transition, even though there are continuities with the Ottoman period too. But in terms of the state support that Berk was asking for, arguing for, we can say that from the late 1930s, I think modernist artists like Berk began to receive more state support than, say, the time he was writing this essay in 1935, January 1935. For instance, Berk began teaching at the academy in 1939, and they were given more exhibition spaces to exhibit their works in, for instance, for Group D artists, whereas in this period about which I'm writing, artists often complain about not having many spaces to exhibit their work in. And also in 1939, we have the beginning of these painters tours that the state organized, and they sent many artists across Anatolia, and then after that they exhibited their paintings produced during those tours, and state also acquired some of the paintings they produced. And if I may add one thing perhaps about the class question of class, it is often written that in this period, the Turkish state didn't necessarily categorize its population through class, but certainly we can talk about class. But that's, for instance, in terms of the elite of the Republican Kemalist elite, they were, along with some artists, I can say that they were influential in designing Turkey's artistic art policies in terms of supporting the artistic production and organizing exhibition. And on the other spectrum of things, we can say that artists increasingly began to pay attention to the peasantry of Anatolia and urban working classes from the late 1930s onwards, targeting them as their primary audience in some cases, as in the Liman exhibition of 1941.
I'd like to jump in for just a moment in terms of the second part of the question, because I do feel very fortunate that because of what I remember being told by both my grandfather and my father. My father graduated from the academy in the 1950s, so Burke was still obviously very active. He was in the studio of Zeki Faikhizer, but I have a small interview in front of me that my father did about 15 years ago, and he's asked about the art scene in Istanbul in the 1950s, and this is his response. The art scene in Istanbul was very weak. There were no galleries. Most of the artists were also teaching. Some came from well-to-do families and lived on their family income. Others really suffered a lot. Life was even more difficult for sculptors because it is always more difficult to sell sculpture. The conditions were harder in those days. It was almost impossible to make a living by selling one's paintings. Only those who taught at the academy and artists with well-known names were able to sell their works. And by well-known names, he's already referring to the earlier generation of artists who were creating more academic works. And so I would ask him, well, how would you show your work? And he said that the best venue that was available to the young artists, to young graduates, were furniture stores. And I think it would be interesting to research furniture store exhibitions in Istanbul in the 1950s. I have no idea how long that tradition continued for, but I remember his talking about that quite often.
And if I can just jump in here for a minute, I wouldn't necessarily, just to address the question from Yanis Tsiligakis, I wouldn't necessarily conflate the rural and the sort of class versus confession aspect of it, because of course there were in sort of elite cosmopolitan circles, there were Muslims, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, right? But there was also likewise in outside of sort of the major urban centers, there were also, lots of Christians as well, right? Sort of my adopted family is through marriage is from Trabzon, Pondios, and from Iznik, Nicaea, and I don't think these are sort of, these aren't cosmopolitan, right, per se. But I think you do make a really important point that both Peter and Özge have both touched upon, that education was really a big part of the mission of, I think, both Tolu and Berk, and that there were all these kinds of government programs that I think are worth talking about. So there's the Türk Ocakları, that I think was actually founded in the late Ottoman period, but really kind of, gained momentum in the Republican period, of these kinds of, cultural organizations that were kind of, sort of in all sort of spread out in all kinds of different towns in the provinces, as kind of like cultural education centers. And I think the arts was definitely a big part of the programming in these places. There's also the so-called country tours, the Yurt Geziler program, where artists were sent around to different parts of the country. And Tolu did participate in that program to sort of, paint different parts of the different parts of Turkey, right? So I think there was kind of like, at this period, I think it is fair to say, there was kind of a civilizing type of mission in arts education that was being promoted at the same time by several of these artists. And of course, what's remarkable about all these newspaper articles, especially the ones I was citing by Jamal Tolu, is that he was publishing these like really extensive art sort of discussions about very detailed topics of art history in the newspaper in Yeni Sabah, right? Like it's like a daily newspaper, and he's sort of, you know, going really in depth on like Goethe. Everyone's getting this sort of summary of like Goethe, like Delacroix, you know, like Soviet painting, right? You know, so even in these newspaper articles and journalism, I think there was also kind of the very clear mission to educate. That is definitely part of this. So. Yeah, so I think that's a really important point to highlight.
Thank you. And following from that point, Yannis Tsilikakis has another question. Was there a religious difference in reception appreciation of art? As to say, the more Western cosmopolitan Christian populations versus the more introvert and parochial Muslim populations?
I think Emily already answered that.
Yes.
Sort of.
Okay. Okay. So, okay, we can. Yes, we can. There's one question for Özge. Özge, you mentioned about the mural, the civil aviation mural. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Because, you know, how did it, you know, come there, and, you know, what was the story behind it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I couldn't elaborate on that part more in this talk, but so this mural was, it was a sketch for a mural to be installed at this aviation factory, airplane factory, and then it was shown. This sketch version, which is now lost, was shown in several major Soviet exhibitions before it came to Istanbul. For instance, there was in 1933-34, the Soviets organized this massive exhibition, really massive, even in today's standards. It was titled 15 years of the Soviet Republic and Soviet Federation. And so it was meant to display the achievements of Soviet art following the October Revolution of 1917, and how the newly emerging Soviet art system, which was state supported, was really, it was meant to demonstrate that this art system was really beneficial for artists' production. At the same time, that exhibition was a venue where this newly emerging idea of socialist realism was being configured visually, even though it was first named in a meeting of the Central Committee. It was not clear what they meant by socialist realism, so it was a task that was left to artists to figure out, looking at existing works and discussing what socialist realism should look like. So Deyneka's paintings was produced and exhibited within this context, and before coming to Turkey, it was actually shown also in the Venice Biennial in 1934. So the same exhibition that was shown in Ankara and Istanbul was previously shown in Venice. And so Deyneka's painting, as it was in the Ankara exhibition's picture that I've shown, it was really prominently placed there. But then I think during these transportations, the work got lost, and there are some papers in the Soviet archives about trying to find out where the work is, where the work was in 1935 after the exhibition went back to Soviet Russia. But this is kind of a contextual history and exhibition history of the work.
other questions?
Thank you very much. There's one other question from Nebahat Avcıoğlu. So was there sorry, the question is, so Nebahat Avcıoğlu asks whether any of these painters present in the World Fair in New York, and has anyone answered the question? Yes, it's here. So 1939 New York World Fair.
I'll just repeat my answer for the recording.
Please, thank you.
I just answered that. That's a really good question. I would love to know the answer to it. I'm not sure if Tolu was represented in this exhibition, but I don't think so. But the best way to know is if you check Adnan Çoker's catalog raisonné of Tolu's work. He has a pretty thorough timeline of the different exhibitions that Tolu was participating in, so that would be a good place to check. There's also the work of Zeynep Yaman also has really very much documented the exhibition activities of these painters as well. It's a good place to look as well.
If I may also add, I mean, it's not an artist we presented on today, but another member of Group D, Abidin Dino, was actually involved as an artist in designing the Turkish pavilion. So there's some existing scholarship on that. That is sort of in the periphery of our work here.
Thank you.
I think we're at the end of the questions, and they were interesting questions. Obviously, the context is much wider than we were able to cover today. However, you answered a lot of really critical issues, and we're very thankful to you. We look forward to reading your theses, your forthcoming books, your articles, and thank you all very much. And thank you, Peter, for your very insightful comments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.